We'll just pause a couple of minutes, let some other people come in who may be a little bit late, having just maybe finished some teaching or finished some other task. Right. Well, maybe we can get off to a gentle start, and people who may still be coming in can come in without missing too much. So, hello and welcome to this Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Citizenship seminar. Before we begin, I just wanted to alert you to an important detail about the next seminar, because the next seminar is on a Wednesday and not a Thursday as we normally have them, but it is 5 o'clock. And it's also possible that it may be a hybrid event, our first hybrid event for, well, however long. And well, ever actually as a hybrid event, but first as an in-person event for what, a year and a half, no longer, even year and 9 months. So anyway, I'll follow that up by email, but just wanted you to be aware of that. Turning to today's event, I'm very pleased that we have as our guest speaker Dr. Semin Suvarierol, and I probably haven't pronounced the name at all well, and she can correct me when she starts. But let me just say a few words of introduction in relation to her. She received a PhD at the Utrecht University and has worked as a postdoctoral researcher in the sociology department of Erasmus University, Rotterdam, on national identity constructions in France, the Netherlands, and the UK in the domain of citizenship policies, and at the public administration department of, again, Erasmus University, on the integration of family migrants in the Netherlands. Her most recent research results in the domain of migration have been published in International Sociology, Nations and Nationalism, Social Politics, Citizenship Studies, Journal of Social Policy, and Ethnicities. So welcome, Semin, and the title of your talk, based on some of that research I just referred to, is From National Models to National Fields of Civic Integration. So I'll hand over to you and let you say anything else you want to say by way of introduction, including the correct pronunciation of your name. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your invitation. Well, I'll skip my name. Anyone who wants can read it in their own time. So today I'm here to tell you about, well, maybe the most important article of my research on civic integration policies in Western Europe. And actually this article has been published very recently this year in Ethnicities, but the research itself took place, I mean, at least the empirical data process took place in 2011. So by now the empirical data is historic, but back then, let's say, when I was collecting it, it was right after the 2005 introduction of all these new policies in Western Europe, new regimes of civic integration that migrants now had to earn their citizenship and had to fulfill a lot of requirements. So that was the driving period, let's say, policy period of the empirical data collection. So, during this talk, I will tell about the findings of that, the empirical findings of that research. But in terms of arguments, the argument is more theoretical as well, which might be also applied to other parts of the policy field or other policy fields, basically. I sort of, or let's say not suggest, because this argument has been made already in the literature recently, to move beyond national models. So what I do is suggest how we can conceptualize it instead, and I use the concept of field, which Bourdieu uses as a more useful concept to look into different policy domains, let's say, in different countries, and use this as a comparative tool. So actually it goes hand in hand, let's say, moving beyond the model and opening up the concept, because usually what we see, at least back then when I was looking at because we always start with the policy documents, right? And then you read about the policy rhetoric, and then you sort of compare on the on the surface. Whereas if we look into the specifics of every country, and also looking not only to national policymakers, but to local policymakers, but also the people who actually implement the policy, then it becomes a messy picture, and then the model does not apply anymore. So that's what I try to do in 3 countries, in France, UK, and the Netherlands, by looking into, well, first different types of documents to begin with, the policy documents, and then also the civic integration courses and civic integration tests. Because in the end, my idea was this is what the migrants experience themselves. That's what they see as integration. So looking from the guy who is making the policy to the guy who has sort of prepared the test questions, to the guy who is consuming or giving the civic integration test or a course, to the guy who is doing the test. So I looked at the whole picture, at least as far as possible. And this I did also through interviews, but also through non-participant observation by sitting within the courses. And sometimes also in the case of the Netherlands, by taking the tests myself, because I was also busy with applying for citizenship back then. So I was also a participant observation back then. So this is how I reconstructed the fields in the 3 countries. And then also, of course, in each country, it was a different picture of who is involved in the process, which actors, and how have they translated this policy into practice, and what was important, which questions or concerns were leading the process. So looking at the theoretical part, I guess the national models part of the story is this part of the story, because it's been out there for quite some time right now. Brubaker is seen as sort of the father of the national model school. But later Favel has also taken up on this with his philosophies of integration. So what they were arguing was that there was this overarching pattern, and then there were some labels attached to every country, multicultural, Republican, and then that's what we use to compare the countries. But what has recently, this has been more recently, let's say, because in the end, this has also been around for some time. And this has been challenged, saying the national models are much more dynamic than we can label them with one thing, and they even shift within countries. So let's move away from them and let's look at them as dynamic entities, which are not that coherent and not that that easy to label, let's say. And also hand in hand with this, I mean, like when these new measures were introduced in 2005, it was happening like almost everywhere in the West European countries. So there were also a lot of people who were seeing that there was a lot of convergence in terms of policy, and it was all repressive liberalism, and also, of course, the neoliberal turn in terms of policies also had an effect. So it looks like there were not national models, but that there was one European model to civic integration. And this was also, by the way, fed and supported by the fact that there were in those years also increasing contacts between EU, let's say, people who were working on this policy domain, and they were coming together in Brussels and etc. to also coordinate. So the policies were also sort of feeding into each other. They were very much informed about each other's policies. So this also led to even more convergence. But still, when you looked deeper, always through case studies especially, you could always see that countries implemented the policies differently, and the feel was different. Yeah, I mean, in that sense, the models were still existing, let's say. And in that sense, if we look at, I mean, in the end, that policy fields or policy contexts are messy and not uniform, and we already know that from Lipsky and his look on the issue, like when street level, if we look down to the street level bureaucrats, we see that is a totally different story than what happens at the top, let's say. And when we look at it from that perspective, we see that to be able to at all call it a national model, we would actually need a quite uniform approach from the top to the bottom, from top level bureaucrats to the frontline workers, and that's of course is very difficult to obtain in practice. So how did we bring Bourdieu into the picture, into studying this messy policy context? Because while I was working on this topic, because I actually, my background is in more public administration, and then I found myself in the sociology department. Actually, I've always been a bit using both approaches, but then I really dived into the sociology literature. And then I was like, wow, this is so useful. I have to bring it into the policy literature. so it was also sort of my freshman attitude, which helped me sort of import some concepts from sociology. And in this process, the Bourdieusian field concept appealed to me as a way of conceptualizing this policy field, because field is a very dynamic concept. It's a very relational concept, so it allows you to understand and pinpoint how the norms are in a group, and which which actors have more power and whose vision is dominating. So this helps a lot in terms of seeing and also breaking into sort of smaller pieces, because okay, it's a messy picture, but we still need some clarity in this messy picture. So that's how I have used field as a system of relations with its own actors, structures of meaning, and then in terms of applying it to a comparative research, the most interesting part of it was to look at the particularity of the field. What makes, for example, one country's field more well, like lean the one way or the other. So that's how I went about. So yeah, I think I also already mentioned some of the things that are on this sheet. So it's basically looking at the dynamics. So, and also because this is a very dynamic approach, then we can also look at how it has evolved within a policy field. Let's say, how did it start? What was the first question that was asked in the policy field? And what did the policy officials think about? What was important for them, and what has changed actually during the process, during the debates and negotiations? Because in the end, it's not like there is one wild policy idea and then everyone accepts it right away. There are always negotiations and discussions, and how some view wins or loses is determined in the process. So that's actually looking at how the resulting policy, maybe we actually, if we look at the policy documents, we just see the resulting rhetoric, but there's a whole story behind it. So this is what we look at also when we're looking here, when we look at the fields. So here I set up some of the main questions I used to operationalize, let's say, the concept of field in the case of civic integration. So yeah, which were the main actors involved? How did they shape it? And then what was included in the content of citizenship courses and tests? What were the dominant citizenship values? What were the rules of the civic integration field? Like, how do you earn citizenship? Let's say, which kind of tests do you have to go through? What is the level of language integration that is required, etc., etc. And I mean, again, going further in this sociological field idea, again, capital is also a concept that is Bourdieu's And then what kind of citizenship capital are were migrants expected to acquire in order to become citizens? And how was this reflected in the design and organization of civic integration courses? So it's not only like what were they required, but like how were they supposed to attain this goal? Because this was also a huge difference between countries. And these are what I found back then, at least, are the parts of the story which you don't hear about usually, because it's either like looks at the policy or the migrants and then how they integrate or something. But like by using the concept of fields, you can sort of also connect the two worlds in a way. And then what you get is actually the overall symbolic order of civic integration, like in the resulting products of civic integration. So now I'd like to go into the countries so that I can talk more concretely, let's say, about how I worked with this concept and what has it delivered, let's say. France was very interesting. Well, I mean, all of them were interesting, of course, but I was amazed by how centralized the whole process was, because the ministry was like everywhere, basically. They were like running all the working groups, and they were involved in the making of the film, and even the PowerPoint presentations that migrants got to see during the civic integration courses, they were like signed by the ministry, and all the contacts had been approved by the ministry. So like in France, the state was involved from A to Z, and like this is I don't know if any other country manages to centralize the process. I haven't studied any other countries in Europe, but this is how a state led civic integration program goes, I guess. And what I also went to all these policymakers, and also at the local level, the implementing office, the OFI, which I was on the previous sheet, like they were almost speaking also with the same language. And they were also really stressing the fact that there is really a consensus in France that the citizenship belongs to the state. So, of course, then we make a uniform citizenship material that's going to be viewed throughout the country, from Paris to whichever small city. And everyone gets to see the same national symbols. So it's the French state, the French flag, the Marianne, liberté, égalité, fraternité. And it's like, in that sense, it was very clear cut what should be in that content as well. And in that sense, there was also, it seemed that there was also no discussion on this point. It was clear what it should be in the content. Nevertheless, at that point in time, the political debate on immigration integration, just like in the other countries, it was quite heated. And so what was specific to France, or to the French political debate, that got some extra attention in the citizenship material. And also when you look at the citizenship courses, like when you like on the participant observation side, you saw that like the issues which were the most visible in the political debate, which were back then gender equality and secularism, like the wearing of the burqa and issues like that, they received extra attention. So the teachers were also giving it more time to explain what this means and what is expected in France in terms of these topics. And what's also maybe interesting is that all these norms, especially like freedom, equality, democracy, secularism, these were not represented as being French, but as being universal and as being like French gifts to the world. So of course, like, you know, as migrants, we're also going to embrace them because they're universal. They belong to the whole world. And of course, we will, to be good French citizens, we will also embrace them. What was still, I mean, regardless of this uniform course material, the course teachers, who were the street level bureaucrats in this case, they could bring their own accents to the course. So if, like, for example, but then it was like more accents and not the substance that was presented, but like they could tell their own story. So if you were, let's say, history teacher giving the course, you could tell more about French history. If you had more of a legal background, you could talk more about institutions and legal rights. If you also had the integration in the country of origin, of course, back then. And there you saw that teachers would talk about how they experienced France and how this would compare with the local culture. So these were sort of the personal nuances that they could bring to the teaching of this uniform substance, let's say. What's also very visible in France was that the teaching of the French language was delegated to professional language institutes and teachers. So they, in that sense, the language part was quite free and also separate from citizenship teaching. So there, the migrants could learn French as any other person learning French, which made it sort of freer in terms of language teaching, and it didn't have to be mixed with the citizenship content. And the other very important aspect was that both French states would finance all these citizenship and language courses fully. And this was great, of course, because it even included a 3-course lunch served at the local bistro. And I could also eat with them. So that's how I know, again, the gifts of participants or non-participant observation. So it was like the French state was totally taking care of the migrants, and then expecting that this taking care of them would also produce loyal citizens in a way, that as the state was giving them something, then they would expect something in return. And that would be integration, of course, and becoming good French citizens. And this is again fits into the French idea of civic integration because it was conceptualized as a mutual contract. So I give you something, you give me something in return. And actually, it was also really contractualized. You had to sign your integration contract, and then by signing your contract, you would also dedicate yourself to fulfilling your duties as a migrant. Another, let's say, aspect where the implementing agents, state agents of had discretionary power was how this gained knowledge by migrants would be evaluated in the end. So France chose not to have a test. This is also ties in, let's say, to the French tradition of having a lot of oral examinations. I studied in France, so I also had to go through sometimes just oral exams and without any written exams. So it also, like, this is actually, you see, like when you look at the whole field, you see also a lot of elements of the national culture, let's say, identity or modes of governance being applied at different parts of the story. So what happens is that if you apply for citizenship, basically, then you're evaluated. Or if you come to the country, then you're evaluated for your level of French by the officer who is interviewing you. In that sense, they also didn't believe that you could test citizenship or loyalty to the state, because it's not something you learn and memorize and then reproduce. You have to understand it fully, experience it, and apply it, and that can only be just evaluated by a person who is working for the state and who can evaluate if you're up to being a French citizen, let's say, which makes it quite subjective on the one hand, but also it gives a lot of room for interpretation, that's true. But maybe in the end, more people pass it because you're being evaluated by a person instead of a computer, let's say. So summing up, French citizenship trajectory is a state affair from beginning to the end, I concluded. So the field is totally dominated by the state from A to Z. Separation of language and citizenship, I also mentioned, and then the financial responsibility of the states, and then fully, which is like combines the aim of the state to take care of the migrants and expecting loyalty in return. When we move on to the UK, in terms of comparing the three countries, UK has a moderate position I concluded, because the state there was taking responsibility where it's deemed necessary, and then also involving professionals and migrants and letting them take the responsibility where they saw fit, let's say, where also like professionals here had a lot of say in the process, and also a lot of say in negotiating what would be the citizenship contents in terms of integrating migrants. But this again reflected the British approach to governance and conceptualization of citizenship as a civic community affair. So in contrast to the French approach, where the citizenship belongs to the state, in the UK it belongs to the community. So it's a product which is formed together with society, and also with the local agents, and also the migrants. And then we come together at the citizenship, and that also changes. So it's in the UK, actually, the citizenship concept in that sense is much more dynamic on its own. So the most visible part of this communal formation of citizenship content was the ABNI, which was an independent board, and then there were leading experts in the field of, again, language education, as ESOL, you call it, I think, citizenship training. And then there were also people involved in the employment of migrants and in community development. And ministry officials were also part of this group, but they were not leading the process. They were sitting on the board. And of course, they were saying what was possible and what was important for the ministry. But the ABNI members were quite powerful, and they had a lot of say in the process. And the ABNI members, whom I interviewed, they also stressed that they had heated debates over what should be the resulting content of the citizenship courses, or like the book, the test, Life in the UK book, and the test, and which questions should come there, and what should be excluded and what should not be included by all means. So this debate led to the conclusion that the focus should be on the practical aspects of British life and not on Britishness, because Britishness is not something you can define because it changes. It's in that sense, to me, it was the most multicultural feeling I got in terms of studying like the citizenship context. And also in terms of discourse analysis, when we look at how everything was formulated, it was very reflexive, always, let's say, saying, well, this is like this, but this can also be interpreted like this, and it can be different for different communities. So it was never prescriptive what was described there as being sort of the British life, because there always the differences were also stressed. So it was Britain as a multicultural society with the plurality of its norms and practices. So in that sense, the state, what was the role of the state in this field? It was more like providing what should be the standards, and that's ensuring that the standards should be clear and not onerous, and should be, well, fair to everyone, and also taking into account the position or the situation of the migrants. What was the most important in the UK was that every migrant would show an effort to integrate. So they would be, they would have to show that they would be one level higher when they completed their course. So if you're already have a high level of English, let's say, then you go ahead and go and do the tests. But also if you start from zero, you can also go and do the test. So it's like there's also a lot of freedom given to the migrants. So it's like the tasks and responsibilities are shared. It's not like France, like this is what I do, this is what you do, but like we do it together, and we do it, we make sure that everyone is okay at the end. And then, yeah, the non-state actors were also participating with their own field of expertise, and also just like, you know, sharing their views and expertise from their own point of view, let's say. So in that sense, states was just, well, but it was an important role in the end, coordinating and facilitating role, but also like making the bridges, and then making sure that like the inputs of the professionals was also taken seriously in that sense. Moving to the Netherlands, there it was another story again. It was, well, it was like the UK in a sense, because it was also decentralized. There were a lot of non-state actors involved, public and private, and they were also inviting migrants to talk about what should be the citizenship content, for example. So it was a complex process there as well, and there was also some kind of debate involved. But there, let's say the professional actors were not that clear-cut professionals, because to begin with, it's like the Dutch language is not like English or French, because the Dutch teachers were not used to, originally used to teaching their language as a second language. And because of that, the language teaching is not professionalized, at least not as a second language teaching. This had actually a lot of impact, because in the end, when the migrants at all came to the Netherlands, the Dutch was taught just by citizens, like volunteers and things like that. And this kept on going, actually. And so when integration became obligatory, and you had to show that you speak good Dutch and that you know the citizenship values, etc., then you had to come up with citizenship courses and language courses, but then you had no professional teachers. So it was like, yeah, right, everyone can teach it, right? Because, yeah, you're Dutch, then you can teach Dutch. And then because you're Dutch, so you can also teach what it means to be Dutch. So it was like very loose in that sense. And then it was, yeah, loose and not professional in that sense. So there were a lot of actors, but they were not necessarily professionals. And the ministry was having a coordinating role, just like in the UK. But it was much more dominant in this coordinating role, because it was much more active in influencing the content of the civic integration. And at that point, it was totally connected to the highly politicized policy domain of migration and integration. So the tone of the political debates at that point totally got, like, almost directly got translated into citizenship content. So what they were talking about at the parliament got into the citizenship test, let's say. So what the result was that you had a lot of normative issues which at that point the political powers or the political parties saw fit. So, and then they were not necessarily just about rights and duties of the citizens, but also about daily norms which they saw fit. For example, about nudity, homosexuality, or what do you do when you go to a birthday party. These are all things that a Dutch migrant should know. And actually, this is also what came out, interestingly, at the citizenship panels, which they set up to talk about what should migrants know when they come to the Netherlands. And they sort of concluded that these were very important things to know. So then these also got into citizenship tests. So it was sort of a soup of norms and traditions and what have you. And then with no clear-cut answers, let's say, because like these things, like also how you behave at a birthday party is also determined by class, by where you live and your family, blah, blah. But this was sort of disregarded and was translated into citizenship content or test questions as if there was some kind of uniform norm, tradition to which everyone should adhere to. And also in the Netherlands, again, reflecting the national education policy, there was no official civic integration course book. So a lot of parties produced their own book, and then the market parties produced their own courses. So it was like a plurality of content and courses, and then like one test at the end. So they were sort of preparing to this ends in their own ways. And also what I talked about referring to the language teaching, that they, in the end, it was not that professional. This was also an issue when it came to also the computerized tests, because there were like commercial parties involved also in the UK, but in the UK it was very professional and tested and retested, let's say, for validity and etc. But in the Netherlands, the resulting tests were not recognized as valid and reliable by independent experts. So, for example, the speech recognition application was not evaluated well, and the questions were not formulated in a good manner. But then this came out, but then they didn't change anything. So it was very strange in that sense. And this I already mentioned, that everyone can teach Dutch. So in summarizing, the Dutch field was very politicized and normative. And then the sense of citizenship, Dutch citizenship, was that migrants had to reproduce a fixed identity, which was supposed to be Dutch societal norms and values. It was decentralized, and but then the non-state actors were not independent like in the UK, but they were accommodating the state in that sense. They were sort of implementing or filling in what the Dutch state wanted. So they didn't offer their alternative view. They didn't question that, for example, testing on these birthday parties or whatever would not be very handy or whatever, or that they could not test that in a very good way. And also what's what's also different in the Dutch case is that it was very emphasized that it was the responsibility of the migrants to integrate and to do all the things necessary to learn the language and take the courses. Actually, the initial idea of the state was that you would also pay for it yourself and look for your course and just do everything on your own, organize everything on your own. But in practice, no one enrolled for the courses. So then the municipalities began to take up on the organization, and they also started financing it. Otherwise, no one was coming to follow the courses, also because it was very expensive. In that sense, UK. There was also a mixed picture in terms of financing the courses. There were some publicly financed courses, there were private courses, but then there you saw also some issues in that sense. Or you could do self-studying, basically. You bought the Life in the UK book and you could study on your own, so then you didn't have to pay anything at all, for the preparation at least. But there you ran across the problem of like that the publicly financed courses were full, there were waiting lists. Though this varied, by the way. In London there were waiting lists, but if you went to Wales, let's say, there the local municipality organized it and there were no queues or whatever. And the private courses were, for example, you could do a course for a week and then you could complete your thing, let's say, because you had to just do one level. That was possible. So in that sense, it was very, in that sense, also interesting. Okay, now I went back to the UK, but now I'll wrap it up. I hope this presentation of the countries has helped you see how actually how interesting it is to dive into the details of every country, and also looking at the sort of the nitty-gritty parts of it, and how all these details actually form the complete picture. So yeah, maybe if you also read the article afterwards, you will also see how, because there I worked it out, every part of the issue in a more organized way, maybe. So in the end, I thought it was a very worthwhile effort, because in the end it was, of course, it requires, well, in-depth case study, of course, to reconstruct the fields. But then it's, yeah, it delivers, let's say, more surprising results than if you would only take the national model approach as a given. So yeah, in the end, I decided also to give, well, it's not obligatory, of course, but if I could give names or labels to every national situation, then I would call France as paternalistic, UK as inclusive, and the Netherlands as the disciplining state. So in that sense, well, I would encourage everyone for going for comparative research to go to take up the challenge and to open the box of national fields. Yeah, that's it, I think. Now I'm open for questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Semin. And at this point, Johan, will you let people join us? Whoever would like to come on the screen, you just mute yourself for the time being. You can, of course, also not present yourself visually if you don't want to, or however you want to do it. And then when everybody's in, Semin, we can start the questions and discussions.
Okay. I can also stop screen sharing now, or I don't know if people will ask things about the sheets, but
yeah, I think you can stop screen sharing now. If we need to go back to it, you can start again.
Yes.
So are people still coming in, or everyone who would like to come in?
Yeah, I think people are still coming in.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Johan.
Yeah, I'm on it. So I can still say some people just declined me just to make sure.
Okay. Well, look, we can start, and people can come in as they wish, or they can stay in a more private position if that's what they want, and so on.
Yeah.
So maybe I could kick things off, Semin. One of the things that I find interesting about your approach, and obviously I know the published article, is that you and the the principles, the research principles you worked with, like Peter Stolten, we were talking about before the start of this seminar, have been very critical of the national models approach.
Mm-hmm.
So, you've come up with this alternative as a, using the Bourdieu fields idea, fields of civic integration. But what I find interesting is that it's actually a very sympathetic approach to the national models one, because the primary fault that you find with the national models is that they are, as it were, too macro. They're about national discourses, kind of national ideas. To use Adrian Favell's term, they're about national philosophies,
Mm-hmm.
philosophies of integration or citizenship.
Yeah.
But the fields approach of finding out what actually happens in practice,
Mm-hmm.
as you have been doing with this research project, doesn't go against the idea that there are national philosophies. I mean, in a way, you've chosen Bourdieu because of the possibility that he offers of identifying different cognitive structures, which is another way of approaching the idea that there are national philosophies or different philosophies in different countries or levels of society.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, as your presentation then made clear, your research project was very sensitive to the differences between the three countries that you've just presented on. So I wonder if I'm right in thinking that your fields of civic integration is actually quite complementary to what has been called the national models, basically it reforms aspects of it and makes it operational for a project like yours, rather than, as some critics have argued, when people say we need to go beyond national models and methodological nationalism and so on, they're offering a much more radical critique than is present in your research project.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. You could also see it as a sort of, well, let's say extending or expanding national models. Of course, when you, I mean, like compare countries, yeah, it's impossible not to look at the national differences anyways, because I mean, that's how you compare in a way. But there were also, of course, common points, and what they were all dealing with at the same time in history. So I mean, like, I was also looking at how the same thing was approached. I mean, like, in that sense, some things were not national because they were facing, let's say, European or global issue. And then they were trying to translate this into their national context. So in that sense, I think it's difficult, not at least also because it's the domain of citizenship, because like citizenship and migration is still, well, maybe becoming less so right now, one of the policy domains where the nation state has the most sort of protected power and say on who becomes my citizen. That belongs to the state. So that was also interesting to look at, because I also have a background in EU policies. It was interesting to look at this domain where nation state is the biggest, to see how much of national modeling is there still in an age where, you know, European cooperation is present, etc. But yeah, I guess I'm not completely rejecting models, but I'm actually encouraging people to look beyond just what's the policy rhetoric and to look at what's happening on the ground, because that's what affects the fate of migrants in the end. I mean, like, if you don't have a good language education, then it also becomes very difficult to learn the language. So I mean, like, it's not like independent of what's happening on the ground, which on the surface doesn't maybe look like it's migration policy, but yeah. So opening up the box is what I call it.
Yeah, well, that, you see, that's exactly, I mean, that's interesting, exactly the point, opening up the box. Some people want to deconstruct the box. But anyway, I very much welcome questions from other people on this point, this general methodological point, or on something else. Did you want to ask a question, Jonathan?
Yes, my question, I mean, a very interesting presentation and lots to think about methodologically, but I'm still kind of working my brain through that. So I think I was going to ask, my question was about one of the contexts, which is France, which is a context that I study as well. And you mentioned that you talked about the way that the debates, public debates on laïcité and gender equality found their way into the kind of, well, the political debates, and then that kind of have an impact on the content of these citizenship courses. And I wondered if you could speak more to that, about how you saw those debates, kind of the process by which those debates outside of that arena ended up entering that arena.
For example, now I'm going to name a few very concrete examples, which I saw it's like present. Like, for example, they in their film, because all these, by the way, back then it also already became fashionable to use visual content. So all these countries made their integration films, right? And in the French film, you had a female bus driver. And this was important to show that women can have all jobs in France, let's say. I mean, like, it's very like playing with the symbols, and maybe it's just a very small detail, but they made a point of it. And then they also, like, of course, discussed about it in class or something. Or like this burqa issue was also back then a burning issue. So, like, for example, when you talked with the people who would evaluate if someone would obtain their citizenship, then they were talking about, yeah, so what if someone comes to the interview with their burqa? Can we say that this person has integrated the French values? Like, things like that. I mean, so, well, taking the big discussion to very small symbolic things with which you could actually also evaluate and also teach what is the norm. I don't know if this answers your question.
Yeah, no. Those are really nice, rich, concrete examples. I just think it's very interesting in the field that I study, which is school education, how laïcité or secularism and gender equality kind of increasingly take precedence over the other values that France adheres, well, that France seeks to promote, I guess. Mm-hmm. It's interesting to know that trend is visible in the citizenship, civic integration courses as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, it was also back then a big issue also at the schools, of course, and also citizenship education at schools. Yeah. So
thank you. Catherine has indicated in the chat that she has to leave early, so I don't know whether you want to ask a question now, Catherine, but if you do, please go ahead. Maybe she's already multitasking and doing various things. So while we're waiting for Catherine to respond, if she can, does anyone else want to come in? Erdem, you came on the screen a few minutes ago and then switched your video off. Were you just testing your video, or were you indicating you wanted to ask a question?
Hello, everyone. Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So I was testing my connection. It was a little bit poorer. Now I think it's a little bit better now. So many thanks for the presentation. It was really interesting and refreshing. And my question is actually quite similar to Tariq's. So I also studied the national models of integration during my doctoral study. And I argued that we need to and we should go beyond the national models and consider another phenomena, which is transnationalism. So while we are discussing and framing citizenship and new identity formations and in the integration of newcomers and minorities, we need to consider transnational actors and processes. So, for instance, we need to look at the roles played by sending states, be it positive or negative. Also, we need to look at how immigrants, individual or group transnational engagements with their country of origin or with third countries. So as far as I understand, your approach, what you call the national fields approach, still considers integration as a two-way process involving immigrants and host countries, as it were. So I wonder, how do you see transnational phenomena? How does it fit into your own approach? Thanks.
Yeah, I think this was a bit beyond the scope in a way. Of course, I mean, like I touched upon it in a way by also looking at what was happening at the countries of origin. At least in my case, I looked, for example, in Turkey and what was happening there, because that was the point where they also introduced some requirements of integration before you even enter the country. So I looked at like how that was unfolding as well. But in the end, I did not look into, of course, how the community was playing a role in the integration in that sense. Yeah, I didn't.
May I ask another question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
So, to my knowledge, a couple of decades ago, maybe still happening, I don't know for sure, but during the 1980s and 1990s, I know that most European countries were negotiating with some of the sending states and even non-sending states, such as Saudi Arabia or some Gulf states. So these negotiations were diplomatic negotiations about the lives and matters concerning Muslims in Europe. So about mosque construction, sending imams or training imams. Even today, a lot of European countries discussing about training local imams in Europe. So back in 1980s and 1990s, they were so keen to discuss these practical issues with the sending states or even non-sending states. So, but now European countries have more localized, domesticated approach to immigrant integration. So I wonder if there is still a room for transnational negotiations for, let's say, Muslim integration in respective countries that you discussed. Like, is there a room for these kind of discussions?
Well, sure. Then I mean, I guess
because
then
I'm
you
asking
would.
Because there's a.
I mean, actually, then I think you would have to ask a different question, right? Then you would have to also expand the field to the transnational field. Then you can also introduce the sending state or the neighboring state or whoever else plays in the field. I mean, I think it's possible. I mean, like, I didn't look into it, but I think it's possible. I mean, like, if you leave the transnational, and I mean, if you also expand the national part to transnational or international, why not? I mean, then it will even become more complex, right? Studying the field, because then you would have to look at all the different networks and of influence, and also like European, as I said. I mean, I barely touched upon it as much as the officials which I talked to told me about it. But that was not my research question. But I mean, I think this conceptual tools makes it possible in a way. I see here also another question. I don't know if I mean I can't answer
Catherine,
further because I didn't ask the question.
Catherine put her question
Yeah.
in the chat. Can you see it?
Yeah, methodological information.
I'll read it out, shall I? On whether you participated in all the context, the information on the context. If so, I'd be really interested to hear more about the migrant side and whether their location in these different fields seem to have consequences for their experiences.
I mean, like, of course, I didn't, like, for example, if we look at the citizenship courses, I didn't participate in every city. So it depended also a bit on the knowledge of, like, I mean, like, I participated, for example, in Paris, and I went to a course provider in London, and then I talked to someone in Abney who was coming from Wales, and then one was in Cambridge, or in the Netherlands. I talked in different cities, but it's not like I could participate in all cities. I participated in one, and then I gathered sort of the story, also talking with other policy.
Yeah, I think, Semin, the issue isn't did you participate in many cities. The presentation focused on what you might call the citizenship test designers and the policymakers, and it's very interesting across 3 countries. And you were a participant observer in a number of these courses or citizenship integration events, but you didn't say anything about the reactions of the migrants. Did you actually interview migrants as well as the professionals and the civil servants and so on?
So I did talk to migrants who were there in the courses I participated in. And what I, for example, saw is like, I mean, now I'll compare again the situation in the UK, for example. Like being in London was for migrants different than being in Wales, because I mean, like there again, I mean, like the UK did not finance the courses, but if you were living in Wales, it did. So in that sense, if you were in Wales, the state's role was also more close to the one in France. So the local situation and the possibilities of the local government also influences what the migrant experiences, and then how the migrant is also taken care of, let's say. I mean, in London, you have to find your way. And also, for example, in London, you even had some courses in mosques or whatever, or within the community, if they organized it within the community. So where you were in that sense mattered, and at least in the UK the most, because the Netherlands is of course a very small place, but there again also, if you were in a smaller city, there was more chance also that the local governments had more resources to take care of you as a migrant, and as a result of which you had more assistance, let's say, on your way to completing your citizenship requirements. So I think I can sum up in that sense that the less migrants in a place, the more care you got or help or assistance you got in terms of
but what about the cross-national comparisons? So you showed that there were 3 quite different national contexts and processes, and you gave them 1 word each: paternalistic, inclusive, disciplining. So what about the people who were at the receiving end of paternalistic, inclusive, and disciplining integration processes? Did they react differently to the 3 different processes, or was that outside the scope of your project?
I mean, from what I could gather with the talks with the migrants, was that the feel was completely different. I mean, like, okay, I mean, I love this bistro thing because when I was sitting there with all these people who were getting a meal from the States, basically, and at the restaurant, so it felt also very welcoming in a way. So that was very different than in the Netherlands, where you were tucked up in a classroom with someone who was hired to teach, because it was privatized, they also totally tried to cut the costs. So, I mean, the people were feeling that they couldn't learn the language properly. They were very also conscious of it. So they just also were, because they could feel this sort of investment was very low and that they had to do it on their own, they also totally instrumentalized this whole process. So they found ways of passing this test as soon as possible. So learn sort of the basics and then, you know, get it done with. So, I mean, in that sense, the feel was very different, and how people also went about with their integration efforts in that sense.
Okay, thank you. So Abdullah has had his hand up for a while. So you can ask your question now. Do you want to the video on or ask it via the audio?
Okay, thank you very much. I just want to ask a question. Did you look into the success of those policies? How effective were those policies in terms of integration, immigrant integration? You mentioned, for example, in the Netherlands, you mentioned that they were politicized, you know, disciplining state. My understanding is that they were very successful in terms of integration and learning the language, because the policy implementation is that they disperse, for example, the immigrants into the whole country. So it is easier when when the immigrants are put in a small village where they don't have people from their culture. It is easy for those immigrants to learn the language, mix with the local people, learn the culture and the language easily. And then people will, I can say, easily integrate. And then maybe, you know, somebody who lives in Paris, where maybe thousands of, hundreds of thousands of people from same culture and language, they may go to bistro or go to a class, but they go back to their small village, small, you know, quartier, whatever they call it, and then start speaking their own mother language with those people. It may take longer. So, yeah, did you look into that angle from your research?
I mean, I didn't. I mean, like, this is very broad, the question you're asking, but I mean, I think also in that sense, the national contexts are also, of course, very different, right? Like the size of the country, I mean, everything matters in terms of migration and how migrants are incorporated into the new country. What you mentioned about the Netherlands, that what you describe is how it used to be in the past, like when people were more like refugees and then they were dispersed into different parts of the country, which still happens in the case of refugees. But we also have economic migrants, and those people tend to be in the bigger cities. So they are still navigating in the national, or I mean, like their own national communities. And in France, for example, I mean, like France is also a very different case. I mean, like in terms of language, because most of the French migrants already speak French. So it's actually a minority who don't speak French at all. So most of the people just do the citizenship course and do not have to do the language course because they already speak French. So I mean, like France's integration challenge is much different in that sense than than the Netherlands in terms of language teaching, because no one speaks a word of language, Dutch, when they come to the Netherlands, and they also don't want to learn it. So it's very different. Also, for example, if we look at the UK in that sense, everyone wants to learn English, so everyone is also motivated to learn English. Whereas in the Netherlands, they're already not motivated, and then they don't get good teaching. So what's the result? I mean, I let you interpret.
Well, I think they may be. I used to live in the Netherlands, and I learned the language there, and I learned the culture. I was something. I used to eat a raw herring, which was horrible. And yeah, so it was easy to integrate it when I was there. It's a long time ago, probably quite a lot of things has changed since then, but it was easy for quite a lot of immigrants when I was there who came to that country from Africa, from Bosnia, from some other Asian countries. I think it was easier because of that dispersal policy the government was leading. So yeah, you're right. It is totally different from when you are coming from English speaking or French speaking country and coming to England or to France. So yeah, definitely.
Good. Thank you, Abdulhai. And I think we've actually come to the end of our seminar. So thank you very much, Semin, for a very, very interesting presentation that combined trying out a whole new methodological approach with the idea of different kinds of integration in different countries, comparative. So that was very interesting for us. Thank you very much. And
thank you.
While most people are not on the screen, I think we can at least show our appreciation in the usual way, at least, insofar as we can use the symbols. I'm trying to, though actually I'm not succeeding. I'll just clap and thank you visually. I'm looking for the clapping function. Thank you, Jonathan, as well. Great.
Thank you.
As I said, next week, not next week, sorry, the next seminar in the series is on a Wednesday afternoon, not on Thursday, and I'll communicate with you about that by email. So thank you everybody for coming, and thanks once again to Semin for her presentation, and bye-bye everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.